Well, yes, you can certainly see the comparisons between that production and the pantomime production of Poppy in terms of the self-ironising or not. So it seems that you went on a journey from your first, sorry for the pun, your first viewing of the show to the subsequent viewing, and then you make that amazing connection between Buddhism and postmodernism, which I don't know has anyone ever made that connection before, but it's convincing if you believe in postmodernism.
Yes,
but anyway, I would like to then, I'm just going to throw this open to the audience now, I think, rather than me say anything else. So, who'd like to go first? You would. Oh, here we go.
I put my hand up before I fully formed my question. I was just listening to both of your talks and this idea of how Chineseness is being constructed. I was wondering if I'm going sort of beyond these productions here, but how that relates to maybe how Chineseness is constructed through, for example, the Beijing opening ceremony, Olympics, and also the Richard III by the National Theatre of China that came to the Globe recently. Does that question make sense?
So you mean constructions of Chineseness coming from China?
Coming from China, which, and this sort of, I don't know, this sort of intercultural space that it's going into, and this sort of commodification of Chineseness coming from China that's playing with Western stereotypes of Chineseness. And what you think is going on there.
That's very interesting.
Shall I begin?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of it's a kind of complicated relationship between artistic funding and artistic kind of agendas in China and those that receive funding to be able to tour globally. So there's a kind of politics that's being played within China's borders which constructs what's fit or good enough or is legitimate in proving a particular point that will then be sent abroad. So in a sense, whatever British audiences receive has already been massively filtered and is already an ideological point that's being made. It's also then clear that any performance that's put on in Britain from a visiting Chinese company, for instance, is going to need to appeal. And things that tend to appeal tend to be things that can be marketed, and I stress the word marketed, as authentic or traditional, because that fits into a kind of stereotype. It's a kind of established market for that. But I think also in pushing kind of traditional and authentic, I mean kind of meaningless terms really, but that kind of marketing and that kind of performance, there's also an attempt to kind of assert a kind of cultural legitimacy and to say that, okay, so communism might only have been around since 1949, but actually we have arts that go back thousands of years. And in much the same way that, for example, ancient Greek theatre is often cited as a means of legitimizing a kind of practice by saying this, we have an equivalent. I think that's something that also happens here, and I think that's also something that relates to the kind of Xiong family as well, in terms of the way in which kind of Lady Precious Stream is marketed. Do you want to comment on that a bit?
Yeah, in terms of Lady Precious Stream, yeah, I mean, it was, for me, very much part of the whole commodity relations between Britain and China, and it fits so well within that it was almost an extension of that. And I guess thinking more broadly about current sort of products coming in from East and Southeast Asia, in the context of the rise of the cultural industries there since the 1990s, and the way in which it's, the pop cultural industry is both being developed as an export industry for economic means, but also, being used as a form of cultural diplomacy. And I guess because I'm doing some research at the moment on young, what they call themselves young Orientals, Eastern, Southeast Asian people in Britain, from a range of East and Southeast Asian countries, and the way they consume the pop cultural products is kind of quite interesting in terms of kinds of translations and mistranslations in what, for example, the Korean government is trying to do through promoting K-pop into the UK, how it's received by young British Chinese kids and becomes a form of self-identification. And then the Korean government is wanting to prove the crossover appeal of K-pop music, so essentially is funding British Chinese young people to fund these events, but they want non-Chinese people to attend them to prove the crossover appeal. So I guess that's just some of the complexity around these issues of cultural translation that occur and the different kind of people, agents that are involved in that process. Don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yes, the lady at the back, right at the very back.
Hi, yes, very interesting papers. As someone who works in the related area of like South Asian theatre and marketing, I'm always interested in this question of authenticity and depiction of identities in terms of from a Western kind of end of the spectrum, and then the frustration, if you're from the cultural heritage, about how authentic it is, you know. So it's a very difficult area generally, but and as someone who's involved in actually selling product that may come from the South Asian end of the heritage to South Asians in the UK to consume it, as well as to non-South Asians, I'm just wondering, you know, is it so wrong if there is a Western depiction of the other, like say in the Monkey Journey to the West? I mean, I saw the Royal Opera House performance and I sat really far back, you know, so it was really hard to see some of the detail.
We were probably next to each other.
But you know, the most amazing thing for me that I realized that when they talk about Journey to the West from the context of China, that was India, and I never actually had realized that, you know, West is always assumed to be as the kind of Occident as opposed to the Oriental. So I'm just interested in this like depiction of authenticity and is it so wrong, you know, if you don't get it 100% right, or if it is mirrored through the trope of the kind of British sensibility, so long as it's not crass. I mean, you know, that's like a one general area that I wrestle with constantly, and your views would be good. But just another quick factual question to ask Diana is that what happened to the Hoising's family after the 50s? Did they kind of live here and die here, or did they leave, or whatever, you know?
Do you want to quickly answer that?
Okay,
and then we can go on to the bigger question.
Yeah, okay. So, Shui actually left in 1956, I think, basically didn't have the kind of visibility anymore, didn't have the kind of work that he wanted in Britain, so he moved to Singapore to explore, you know, basically better career opportunities there. And he spent the rest of his life sort of moving between Taiwan, Hong Kong, and different places. His wife actually stayed in the UK till she died, 1980s, I think, late 1980s. Yeah.
So they separated.
They separated, yeah.
They were not the
but they weren't
Shums.
exactly. That's the kind of part of the story about how happy the happy Shums were.
Okay, so the other question about how much does it matter whether depictions are supposedly authentic or not, or
I think there's kind of, I can only really answer that question in relation to China and say British Chinese performance. And there are kind of two ways of doing that. I think the first is to say that this production was supposed to be taken to China and it was going to be performed there, but actually the tour didn't happen. And I was postulating about, well, actually, how would that performance have been, how would that point, the point that it makes, actually be considered in a kind of urban Chinese city? Because this was never going to be touring around the provinces, this was going to be going to the cities. And actually, I think the point is the same. The point is about a rejection of capitalism and a rejection of kind of surface, kind of pursuit of kind of capitalism for its own kind of material ends. And actually, that kind of critique is extremely relevant to contemporary China at the moment, particularly in the cities. So actually, I think that the kind of performance, as it were, works for audiences in China as well as in Britain, and it's a shame that that was never tested out. And I don't know the reasons for that. Though I notice now that Holborn and Hewlett don't work together anymore, so it might be something to do with that. In relation to your other question, actually I do think it's a problem, and I think it's a problem in the context that we live in at the moment, when there's no Arts Council or government funding for any kind of British Chinese performance enterprise. And whilst performances like this are able to garner and utilise huge marketing techniques, so actually we're talking millions of pounds, multi-millions of pounds going through the box office, versus an unfunded company who are trying to make a kind of alternative and to kind of contest these kind of tropes. When the funding isn't there for that, then yes, it is a problem.
I mean, I accept that point, but I'm trying to look at it from the other end. Like, if Lady Precious Stream was put on today, I know that you did it in Archway, but I couldn't get to see that, but in the same way as Monkey Journey would be, you know, it would be interesting to see who the audience for that would be and what they would take from it with Chinese actors, really, not with Western actors.
Yes. I mean, the performance I directed did use British actors. And the point of that was because I wanted, it was actually really, I did the performance because I wanted to know what it might have been like so that I could write about it. But actually, in terms of how it became framed, it had to be framed as, first of all, a contemporary reenactment, which then it kind of begins to draw upon anti-illusionism to say that this is a construct, and then to situate it back in the 1930s, again as a kind of construct. So basically you had things like actors being contemporary actors, then becoming 1930s actors who then became the characters who were on stage. So I think there are kind of this politics is very complicated and very difficult, and on the whole I think the British Chinese community who came to see it were very positive and supportive about it. Well, that's what they said to me anyway. So I don't know, but it's a very difficult, the issue of identity, and particularly because I'm not from that community, is a vexed one. And I can't really comment on it more than that, I don't think.
Over here, please. Here, second row in the middle. Thank you.
Please allow me to introduce myself before speaking. I am a graduate student from National Taiwan University. I study literature and finance, and it's my third week in London. And I currently study Shakespeare in King's College. And I have some comment to make on Monkey, Journey to the West. I believe it's an adaptation of the one of the most important novels in the 17th century in the Ming Dynasty called 西游记. But there are two aspects of the presentation that contradict my understanding of this novel. Because this is an extremely important novel for Chinese history. So I was born in Taipei and I lived all my life in Taipei, Taiwan. And we've been studying this novel since elementary school. And the name of this is 西游记, and the central character should be the monk, Tang Sanzang, not the monkey. His name is Sun Wukong. But the title of this performance is called Monkey, so we're kind of blurring the focus. And this is more of a pilgrimage than a journey, because Tang Sanzang, he is a monk, so he goes to the West in search of the holy script from the Buddha. So this is, if I make the production, I will call it the pilgrimage to the West by the monk, instead of the monkey journeys to the West. It kind of, so when I didn't see the performance, the production, but when I just, from your description, and I saw the image from the National Opera House, so I was very confused because it really is not my understanding of this novel, 西游记.
But I think in Chinese performance, in Jingji, for instance, Sun Wukong is the kind of central character of the scenes that are shown.
And in the West here, of course, we had the television series of Monkey, which might make audiences here, that would be their connection and familiarity with it.
And Alban and Hughes were very clear that unless they could reference that Japanese kind of a program somehow, then they wouldn't do it. But I think that I think one of the things that's tempting and that the critics did was to talk about this as a British project, but actually it isn't really. It's a kind of Asian American British project with a lot of Chinese actors in it. So that's kind of the first thing. But I think actually, in terms of the way in which this performance is shaped, the way in which the emphasis is given, I think fits Beijing opera models very closely. Particular kinds of wuxi, the kind of martial performances, which kind of Sun Wukong will be kind of framed within. The kind of pace of the kind of dramatic pacing of the work meant that it kind of started off quite kind of slow and exploratory. But then we got more and more and more and more fight scenes, and kind of towards the end, then we had the marvelous plate spinners and lots of choruses cooing. So I think actually that structurally there's a kind of, in this performance there is a drawing upon Jinju performance styles, dramatic structures, Western opera, but also something that I didn't have time to talk about, is British pantomime, because you have the horse, and the horse is present on stage, and British audiences, I think, through the marketing, through the fact that this was timed over Christmas, because of associations with Aladdin and childhood, would have viewed this as a kind of over-glorified panto, which kind of is where the kind of analysis that I put forward falls down, because for a lot of the audience it was just a fun night out or a Chinese meal, which is kind of what Diana talked about.
What made your transition from your initial dislike of it and walking out of it to going back to it and thinking about it in a different way? How did that happen?
I think it was when I walked out the second, because I was as I said, appalled about it. It was when I saw it at the Opera House, because I just thought because of the proscenium arch and because of the context of the performance at the Opera House, it just kind of connected to all the kind of 18th century kind of, and early 20th century.
So it was a context, like the RSC production.
Absolutely. But then as soon as it was moved to this other place, I kind of had to wrestle with why it was there, and was it just a kind of sellout? But then when I actually walked up towards it and I saw Canary Wharf kind of beaming out of the tent, and I just kind of walked all this way around, and then I
So you made those connections, but do you think they were coming from the production itself as well? You do think?
I do think that. I do think that, because otherwise, actually, it's either an extremely lazy and incoherent piece of work,
or it's
which
a very clever one,
or it's a very clever one. And I don't know, it's one of those two. Definitely one of those two.
It's very interesting to see the presentation of this novel is through opera, because this is a novel. And in China, we have the different form of drama, opera, 京剧. And this book is always viewed as a novel. We read it and we don't see the production, the performance on stage. So it's very interesting to see here in Britain, presentation of this novel is through stage, through visual art.
Yeah.
So very interesting. And Sun Wukong is the most outstanding characters in the whole novel. So I understand why this is called Hou, monkey. Yeah, because he is although he is not a central character, but the description of him takes up most pages in the novel. So he's kind of the most important character.
Yeah, I mean, he's not the most important, but he's the one that everybody wants to know about.
Yeah, he's only a disciple of the Tang San Zhang.
sorry.
It's another question about Monkey. Because this year, at the tent, which was their use for Monkey, is going to be restaged, and there's going to be Paul O'Grady as Lily Savage, as Widow Twanky and Aladdin there, which made me start thinking, could you actually just speak a little bit more about the audience that you observed at that production? Because it would be really interesting to do a comparison of those two representations together. Obviously, that's not going to be till December. And also, just as an aside, Kudos, the big pantomime producer that I talked about earlier, they've toured a 90-minute version of their 3D CGI genie version of Pantomime Aladdin to China. I don't know any more about that. It did, I think, 5 venues, was bilingual, and had sort of 50% UK actors, and then they recruited the other 50% out there. So that's just an aside. But yeah, the audience, I'd be really interested to hear more about what you observed.
Sure. It was a real mixture, and I think at the Opera House, other people here were also there to probably expand this. But because it was a quite limited run at the Opera House, it was kind of probably about 35% Royal Opera House mailing list people. And then quite a lot of people wearing Gorillas t-shirts. So it was a kind of like, we must catch this now while it's in London. So there's it's a limited run. It seemed to be quite a lot of pressure on tickets, and I was getting a lot of harassment by ticket touts outside, which always tells you a lot. But O2 was different. It was much more family orientated. I would say in both cases predominantly white British. It wasn't a particular. I actually didn't spot very many. For instance, representatives of the black community. It did seem like a very white family, fairly middle class activity, and the tickets weren't particularly cheap. They were about £40. It's kind of like, it was almost kind of a rock concert. Yeah.
Okay,